Hello everyone and welcome back to Silas Podcast, or welcome to Silas Podcast and welcome back to another ARC review. And this time we're talking about another short story anthology. Do you remember when I said approximately 15 times that I'm not the biggest fan of short story format? I don't know why I keep reading them, but they have entranced me at this point. Let's just get into it. So the short story collection I'll be talking about today is A Chronicle of Monsters by 10 different authors who have or might have not and are at the verge of publishing different fantasy works as well, so they're usually not just in this anthology. I will be leaving everything, all of the information, as per usual, down below so you can check all of these authors out. You can give them some love on social media websites, and you can also order or pre-order some of the books that they have already written or are writing in the future. And, let me preface this by saying I had a fantastic time with this anthology, actually. Remember, addendum to the one before, that I said I don't hate short story format, but I think it's very easy to mess it up and to try and put more information into a short fiction than you can possibly justify being there. Honestly, these authors nailed it. They had such a great hand on things. They were able to give me the information I needed to understand what was going on, but then did not expand upon this too far, because some of these short stories were actually really damn short. Like, they were not all equal in length. I think, like, for example, one of the first ones, which was The Beast of the Greyswood, was one of the longer ones in the story. Like, most of them, at least in the edition that I had available for myself, were approximately 20-ish pages, but some were even just between 10 and 15. So they really didn't have super much to work with, and that, in my opinion, is the big challenge about short fiction, right? Is you don't have that many pages, and depending on what you try to work with, you're gonna struggle with how exactly to put that into a short story format. And these authors did so incredibly well. I'm super happy to have read this. So, A Chronicle of Monsters is essentially 10 short stories that have something to do with the monstrous in some way or another. Like, sometimes we see things from the perspective of the monstrous, sometimes we see a commentary on the monstrous, and depending on how these are depicted, they delve into various different ideas of what it means to be a monster versus what it doesn't mean to be a monster. And what I really liked about these stories is that a lot of them went with very different angles, which probably sometimes also correlated with the author's experiences themselves, but also just in general try to light upon different things you could talk about when we refer to monsters, right? A common rhetoric right now that has started to arise for a while now is that monsters usually refer to the marginalized, and so more often than not, a lot of authors nowadays try to kind of reclaim the monstrous image in a way. Sometimes this is done by saying humans are either just as monstrous, if not worse, even though they might look nicer and might be able to hide themselves behind their humane exterior. This was, for example, something the first story kind of alluded to. The first story, in my opinion, had a lot to do with, maybe not a lot to do, but it reminded me of The Witcher in a way, because our main character is a monster hunter and he does encounter a monster, but it's not exactly as clear-cut as it seems at first. So the first story, in my opinion, was relatively straightforward with what it was talking about and what it was trying to talk about in regards to who is the monster and who is the human, or maybe not just necessarily who's the monster and who's the human, but who is justified in their actions and how are these actions justified. Which is something that a lot of monstrous fiction, as of right now, kind of likes to talk about. Because it all basically comes back again to the fact of, like, why would we claim something as monstrous just because it looks different, right? And why would we not extend that same courtesy to a human being who does truly horrible things? But also, if we just claim a horrible human to be a monster, aren't we doing kind of the same thing that, you know, we keep on doing with these things? Aren't we kind of claiming that you have to be a monster in order to do something horrible? There's a lot of thoughts to be had here, and I personally think that this anthology kind of like tried to go for a lot of different ones. There was also one I really enjoyed where the perspective that we have is that of, it's never like fully explored, but it's basically, it feels like a dog but on fire. A magical monster that, because of their nature, keeps setting things on fire because, you know, they are on fire. And in my opinion, what that story also did was, first of all, while it also included the perspective of something that might be deemed as monstrous, it also included the very important questions of how exactly can we deal with a nature that is destructive at its very core, that might or might not endanger other people? How do we deal with that? Because the answer the short story found was very clearly we should just not leave creatures like that alone, because they might rampage without meaning to, if they are not given the means to adapt to something, or the means for a society to adapt to them. And I also really enjoyed the fact that the perspective, because it was from such a being that was so inhuman just in its appearance, but also in the fact that it wasn't really raised with other humans necessarily, a lot of these stories then delve into the fact that what we might find universally appealing, or what we might find universally understandable, is something that is not necessarily universally understandable for everyone. Because unless you've grown up in a society, you're not going to learn and then also inherit its inherent values, which we think as self-explanatory, except they aren't, are they? And I really, really enjoyed how the author went about all of this, because it's a thing that I personally think is very underappreciated in a lot of fiction, even the ones that are set in completely different universes, or that are told from very different perspectives that are not necessarily supposed to be human in the first place. Because what we do with fiction is that we try to relate to it in some way or another, right? Whether we be the author of that story or the reader of that story. This is just something that is honestly at this point common sense. You are going to relate to a fantasy story through whatever it is that this fantasy story has in common with the real world. That's just how it is. You don't necessarily have the power to change that in any way, shape, or form, unless you try to make yourself familiar with various different forms of thinking, in which case you are still probably going to miss the mark sometimes with people that are supposed to be inherently inhuman because they're supposed to be monsters, they're supposed to be creatures, without trying to assign any value to that word right now, which is very hard because for us, like on a very deeply taught level, if something is supposed to be monstrous, it's supposed to be horrible, right? We keep taking that word when we refer to horrible actions, for example. So I really enjoyed the author making the very hard, sometimes, decision to have this story be told from a perspective that is very different from that a human would have, which also means that some concepts, like, for example, books or reading or fire, the fact that fire is destructive, for example, if introduced to wooden structures, was something this creature had to learn very painfully, because it's their nature to be fire, or to be like fire, or to have fire around it. And it also, in my opinion, touched upon the very important fact of communication, and how communication can be misunderstood if both parties are coming at it from very different sources. Which is also something that I think a lot of these stories kind of touched upon every once in a while, because it is so easy for a monster to misunderstand a human, or for a human to misunderstand a monster, if there's not an effort of communication on the same level happening. And I really enjoyed that about a lot of these stories. Some of them, or at least one that I definitely know of, are also connected to larger works the authors are doing or have been doing. Like, for example, Taylor's story, because Taylor has, or will have, I should say, a book art that basically takes some of the previously known characters from that story. The book Taylor is going to publish is The Flowered Blade, if I remember that correctly, and the short story I'm talking about is, I believe it's Lady of the Dark. Yes, it's Lady of the Dark. And I also really enjoy that, because I personally like it when short stories are kind of like appetizers to a bigger story, or appetizers you get handed to yourself after a bigger story. Because it also makes it a little bit easier on the author by not having to establish the entire world, but basically just being like, okay, so here's like the gist of it, here's 5 bullet points that you need to know in order to understand this world, now let's get going, let's just enjoy these characters. I, for one, am super excited to start The Flowered Blade. Really, really excited, because I want to see these characters again that I've now got to know through the short story, and I want to see what's going to happen there. So that's also something really nice that you can look forward to if you get this anthology. And then also Taylor's book, because you should support him anyway. You should support all of these people, actually. This is why they're all going to be down in the description box. As well as, obviously, where you can get this anthology, A Chronicle of Monsters, which, by the way, is coming out March 27, so you still have a few days to pre-order it, and you have a lot more days to actually get it once it's out, and support all these authors and give them your love. And let yourself be enchanted by these stories, because so many of them were so incredibly interesting to me. And I will say, I don't think I ever had the feeling of, oh my god, I really, really need to... Well, I had the thought of, like, you know, I want to know more about these characters, I want to know more about this world, I want the author to write more in this world in particular, but I don't remember any story that truly made me go, I think this is too short, I think we needed more information about this, or, oh no, I think we really truly needed to do something about this, we needed to examine something about this particular part here. I feel like all of these stories knew what they were trying to accomplish, and they knew what they were trying to say, and they did so, and then the story was over, and it was fine. Again, I would have liked more in some cases, simply because the worlds were very intriguing that the authors had made. And so, for example, I'm super happy that Lady of the Dark are the side characters that I might or might not get to know again in The Flowered Blade, because I'm super excited for that. But all of these stories were so incredibly self-contained that I honestly have to commend the authors for that in general, because that is such a hard feat for a 15 to 20 page short story, and they nailed it, all of them. Fantastic. And to just brush very briefly upon another theme that some of these stories introduced, and one in particular, which is called, where is it? Oilback beetle symbiosis. Some of these stories, and this one in particular, very succinctly also talked about the relationship monsters and humans can have when they're trying to live together, but where they might not fully understand each other. Because the short story that I'm talking about, Oilback beetle symbiosis, is basically about this clan of people who are nomads, and they have this tenet of never looking and never going back, and they take it so incredibly literally that if you start retracing your steps even just a little bit, you basically get kicked out of the clan, which happens to one particular character who is just always referred to as the witch, because she dared to go back. And they live in symbiosis with these massive oilback beetles, whom they basically shepherd through the place that they are going through with these beetles, and they also use a lot of their produce. I do believe they also like legitimately milk them, so that's something. They use a lot of the produce the beetles have in order to further their clan's well-being, essentially, right? And our main character at some point does get to notice that maybe it's not so much a symbiosis as they think it is, because they never truly try to understand the creatures that they were living side by side with, and by hanging on to their tenets so literally, they also, like, they as in these people, hindered themselves and their growth because they didn't even think about approaching something from a perhaps slightly different perspective. And I really enjoyed the aspect of symbiosis, but also the aspect of not being able to understand someone or something because whatever it is not communicating in the same way a human would. Because of course a beetle, in this case specifically beetles who don't really talk, a beetle is not going to be able to tell you that you're hurting it. It's the same thing with the fact that a lot of animals communicate, for example, through body language that we humans might or might not be able to fully understand. And so often we are left with this grappling for an understanding that we might or might not never achieve. And I really enjoyed how some of these stories brushed upon this one in particular, of course, but a lot of the other ones had like small inklings of that as well, brushed upon this gap of understanding that has to be established at some point, because if you keep living together, especially in this story like the humans and the beetles are, you do have to understand where the other one is coming from and what the other one needs and what they don't need, and also what you probably shouldn't be doing to them, how you shouldn't be hurting them, for example, just to further your own clan's living experiences, basically. And that was also an aspect that I really enjoyed looking at and talking about in particular when it came to the whole aspect of monsters and humans coexisting in a place together. And I think this is also something that a lot of fantasy books at least try to brush upon if they have various cultures, some of whom are definitely not human. And it's always a delight for me because I find it so interesting to see how people interact with each other and how creatures interact with each other and how language barriers as well as cultural barriers can be crossed without demeaning one or putting one culture in its place, for example, as the inferior or something along those lines. And I really enjoyed that this also applied to monstrous creatures in this particular anthology, and not necessarily just to one humanoid to another humanoid, for example, who have similar values that maybe complement each other and contradict each other in like just the slightest way, but truly people and creatures so unable to communicate on a shared basis that it takes drastic events for someone to realize that understanding is not guaranteed and that you have to work with that in order to be able to coexist in a society that relies upon each other. I found that really, really cool, and I really enjoyed what the authors were doing with all of this. So yeah, I think the only thing I can genuinely say is this is one of my favorite short story anthologies I've ever read. I really enjoyed all the ideas the authors went for. I really enjoyed that not every single one of them was going in the same direction of, you know, well, that what looks monsters is not monsters after all, and it's the humans who are the real monsters. Because I do think that that is an interesting angle to approach, but it's an angle that has already been approached so many times that at this point, if you want to do like at least a tiny bit of something new, you might want to try and introduce something else to the mix. And especially in a short story anthology, I do enjoy it when there's like an overarching theme, but when the authors very clearly explore different angles of that same theme, in this case monstrosity, and how monstrosity interacts with humanity and vice versa. And I really, really enjoyed that not every single one of these authors was going for the exact same thing, because it truly showed the breadth and width of this particular subject worthy of discussion, and I was a big fan of that. So if you like short stories, and or if you are willing to give them another shot, and if you would like to support some queer indie authors making queer monstrous stories that talk about the coexistence between monstrosity and humanity, and the way the lines are blurred between the two of them sometimes, and the way you don't always fully know what exactly you're going to get yourself into when it comes to that, I highly recommend pre-ordering this or getting the anthology when it comes out on March 27, giving these authors some love, maybe supporting some of their works that are already out or the ones that are going to be out in like I think The Flowered Blade, for example, is dropping in April. I think somewhere around the end of April, if I remember that correctly, but I'm going to be putting all of the authors' links down below. They are going to tell you everything on their respective social media pages, so if you want to check that out, please do so. Please check out this anthology. Thank you so much to the authors so that I could read it and also spread the word a little bit and tell everyone how much I loved this. And, yeah, tell me in the comments down below if you have any stories about monsters and or humans interacting with each other and how these stories handled that and how much you enjoyed that, because I always like hearing about this. Because monstrous theory is something that is super interesting, specifically obviously to fantasy fiction, but just in general. Because I really, really enjoy these different aspects of it and how you can discuss them. Let me know in the comments down below if you have any of these stories and whether or not you enjoyed how they handled things. And as always, I hope that you have a nice reading experience yourself and that you keep having a nice reading experience, maybe with this anthology once it comes out. I would recommend it. And I will see you soon.